An elderly couple was attacked on their farm near Tzaneen over this past weekend. It's a couple whom I know very well personally, because I grew up in Tzaneen, but not just because I grew up in their vicinity, but because they are good friends of our family. I remember them visiting us at our house and us visiting them on the farm. And I remember spending time and having conversations with them in the very same house in which they were now attacked and tortured. Oom David Grobbelaar, as I know him, is 84 years old, and Tannie Liesbeth, as I know her, is 79 years old. And they are quite well known in the Tzaneen area because they are so, and they have been through their whole lives, very active with community work. Not just with their business, but in the community, the cultural community especially, doing work that is not necessarily profitable, but that is to the benefit of the community. And I know them as a conservative Christian couple, very religious couple, church-going, always talking about, or often talking about their faith and so forth, and not the type of couple that would do anything to harm a fly. But the attackers don't seem to discriminate. They don't target their victims based on some sense of morality. And so they sat down, Oom David and Tannie Liesbeth, over the weekend. I think they just had dinner. They sat down in the living room to watch television when they were suddenly surprised and overrun by attackers in their own house. The attackers then started kicking them, beating them. They tied them up, and then they started beating them with iron rods, or an iron rod, I don't know, beating them over the head, beating them in the face, kicking them around, and so forth. They then asked David for the keys to the safe. But David was recently diagnosed with Alzheimer's, so he didn't know where the keys to the safe is. And he said to them that he doesn't know, which of course, as could be predicted, led to more beatings. Tannie Liesbeth then told them something along the lines of that she knows where the keys are, or might know. So they dragged her through the house to the safe, or to where she said the keys might be, and eventually they got the keys. They couldn't open the safe. She had to help them. They took their cell phones, switched them off, and they fled with some firearms. Now, I'm very happy to say that that they are still alive, that they have survived the attack, and that they are recovering, which says something about their resolve. Imagine being an 84-year-old man, being tied up in your house, being beaten with rods over the head and in your face and so forth. But under the circumstances, they are doing well, or better than one expected. Now, the thing with these farm attacks is they happen so often that you can't talk about it every time it happens, because then you would talk about it all the time. So in my book Kill the Boer, I quote police statistics, because there's always a debate about the statistics. But according to the police, over a period of 2 decades, there were 2 farm attacks every day and 2 farm murders every week in South Africa. Now, this is an example of a farm attack where there was not a murder. And so this happens so frequently that you can't talk about it all the time. And so I posted this on Twitter, and I asked, or X, and I asked 2 questions this morning. The one was, what kind of barbarian do you have to be to engage in an act like this. Because remember, they didn't have to do the beatings. They didn't have to torture this couple. They were evidently young and strong men who could have just threatened with violence. They could have pointed a firearm at them or some form of a weapon, or they could have just tied them up. But after tying them up, they had to start beating them. And what is quite annoying about this conversation that has been going on for several years is that whenever something like this happens, you always find people rushing to defend the perpetrators and to blame the victims. And even more than in political circles, you find this in media circles. You find commentators and analysts, with arguments about inequality, saying, well, if we didn't have inequality, this wouldn't have happened. And if it's true that these attackers were hungry, why did they have to do the beatings? And so this part of the phenomenon is always swept under the carpet or left unanswered, because it clearly shows that there's something bigger at play here. So the question is, what kind of a person do you have to be to do this? But it's not as if this is an isolated case. It is something that happens quite frequently. And so the second question I asked, to an extent, has already been answered in what I've just said, was, why is this not a big story in the news? You can read about this in the Afrikaans news on Marula Media and Netwerk 24, but there's hardly any news about this in the English-speaking media. And so I asked this question, and I was immediately responded to by some leftist EFF member or something, who said, let me read the response, who responded with, the RSA, which is South Africa, has a high crime rate. I'm sure a lot of people lost their lives over the weekend, so a person who was kicked and slapped wouldn't make headlines. Now, firstly, it's remarkable just how disrespectful this response is. But secondly, there's some element in truth in this, in saying that this happens so regularly, it shouldn't be news because it happens all the time. But sometimes it does make the news. Sometimes incidents of violence on farms is national and international headlines. And there's an explanation for this. It's not just some political or philosophical argument. It's something that is verifiable with data. And we've done this research. A few years ago, we contracted a researcher to do a study for us to look at all the incidents of violence on farms that we know of, to put them on a spreadsheet, and then to see how does the media respond to this, to look at all the variables, to try to figure out what makes an incident of violence on a farm newsworthy. And what we found was quite discouraging, and it is that there is one variable that rises above all the others exponentially, and that is the race of the perpetrator. Not the race of the victim, the race of the perpetrator. In other words, to put it more bluntly, it is news if the attackers are white, which happens very rarely. Incidents of violence on farms where the perpetrators are white, but if you read the news, you would think it happens all the time because they only report on those cases. In fact, we have found that if you compare two typical scenarios, one of incidents of violence on a farm, one in which the attacker or the perpetrator is white and the victim is black, as opposed to one in which the attacker or the perpetrator is black and the victim is white, the incident where the perpetrator is white is reported on, especially in the English media, 16 times as much as when it is the other way around. And when I say 16 times as much, I mean news reports being published about this. Firstly, reporting that it has happened, but then also analysts commenting on this, opinion pieces published on this, and repeated news reports about this, which boost this brutal farmer stereotype, this perception of farmers, especially white farmers, being these evil, brutal people, because every time they do something wrong, the entire country hears about this. And the international community and the international media is eager to report on this. But when it's the other way around, it's just swept under the carpet. And so there's two very important things that we should learn from this or take away from this. The first is just why, again, a justification of the fact that we need to spend time to build our own media networks, to build our own alternative media structures. This is obviously this is just one of the many obvious examples as to why people are losing faith in the media, in the mainstream media, why people don't regard them as objective anymore. Because whether it's deliberate or whether it's just implied, it's very clear that there's a bias in the way in which they report on the news. They choose to report on the stories that supports their ideological predispositions, and they choose not to report on the stories that doesn't suit them. And so you can create fake news by omission, by choosing not to cover a story. So we need to continue building our own communication networks. And then the other, which is just as important, if not more important, is just links to the fact that I haven't discussed in this video, but have discussed before and will continue to discuss in future. It has to do with the fact that the police, the South African police and the government services are not really in the picture when it comes to responding to these attacks. Firstly, there's this whole debate about whether farm attacks should be regarded as a priority crime, which is an issue in itself. But then secondly, we all know in South Africa, if something like this happens to you, you don't call the police. I was once in an armed robbery where people were killed, and I actually called the police as I was lying under a table in a restaurant expecting to be shot, and the police didn't answer their phones. I then contacted AfriForum's private security, and they immediately responded, and they were there within minutes. So, and my case, my example was not an isolated case. So this just again underlines the importance of building local community safety structures. Being involved in our communities, playing a role where we can. We don't all have the same personalities and talents. Some of us can drive patrols at night. Some of us can shoot. Some of us can do physical stuff. Some of us can do self-defense. Some of us can work with radios, operate radios, or develop strategies, or help in other ways. And you don't necessarily need to drive patrols if you are an elderly person of 84 years of age. But the community can. And so we have found that the extent to which farm attacks or farm murders have been declining in recent years has nothing to do with the police coming to the scene or doing what they are supposed to be doing, and much to do with local communities. And so through, for example, AfriForum's work in communities, we've had many cases where the attack was stopped as they happened, where the perpetrators were captured on the scene. And we've had cases where they were prevented before they happened, and we've just seen in many cases where crime and farm attacks have declined. And then also in response to the attacks, many cases where the perpetrators were caught or captured by the local communities, by farmers themselves, or people in the community driving patrols, arresting them themselves and then taking them to the police. So the lesson herein is that we need to keep communicating about this. And within our communities, we need to be more organized, better organized, and we need to recognize that for those of us who haven't recognized this yet, that the government is not going to fix these problems. The only way to fix them is through our own communities and our own community institutions.